Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, wow, we are taking on a pretty monumental subject. 3 millennia of Jewish history.
It's huge.
Yeah, it really is. It's just such a dense, powerful, and often, frankly, agonizing story of faith, survival, and this endless pursuit of a homeland. I mean, this history, it spans the entire globe. It's influenced pretty much every major world culture.
Absolutely.
And yet somehow it's remained fiercely distinct, hasn't it? Despite all these repeated attempts at, well, annihilation.
It really has. It's arguably one of the most unique narratives in all of human history. When you start digging into the collected source material, you realize, we're dealing with a people whose very existence seems defined by destruction, resilience, and then rebirth, again and again.
So what's our mission today? What are we trying to extract from this vast timeline?
Well, I think the mission is to try and pull out the core of that narrative, what you call that unbreakable will, and maybe find the specific historical, religious, and even some esoteric facts that help explain how this small, often stateless group became so central to world history.
Right, from ancient Canaan all the way up to the modern startup nation.
Exactly. It's quite a journey.
And what I find really compelling about this deep dive is that, as you said, we're not just sticking to the standard history books.
Oh, not at all.
Our sources, they kind of force us to cross this thin line, don't they, between documented history, foundational prophecy, and, well, according to some interpretations, even mythology, or maybe accounts of extraterrestrial encounters.
It's definitely layered investigation. Fascinating stuff. You have to approach it with an open mind, I think.
Okay, so where do we begin? Geographically.
Yeah, let's start there.
Yeah.
We have to set the stage. The theater for the earliest acts of this drama is Canaan, or the Levant. If you picture a map, it's this tiny, fertile strip of land.
Right, squeezed between big players.
Yeah, exactly. You've got the vast Mediterranean Sea to the west, the arid Arabian Peninsula south, and then the huge power centers of Mesopotamia. Think Babylon, Assyria, and Anatolia, the Hittites, sort of surrounding it.
So being stuck in the middle like that, a perpetual crossroads.
That's the perfect description. It made it an inevitable point of conflict. I mean, think about it. Anyone traveling between Egypt and Mesopotamia pretty much had to pass through the Levant.
Right. But you also mentioned it was a place of huge cultural exchange, too.
Precisely. The sources really remind us that while conflict was, constant, cultural interaction was also incredibly rapid. Take the Phoenicians, for example.
The great traders, right, from the northern Levant.
Yeah, the seafaring masters. They operated out of cities like Tyre and Sidon, and they gifted the world something incredible, the phonetic alphabet.
The basis for so many languages today.
Pretty much all Western ones. Greek, Latin, eventually our modern languages. That's the enduring legacy of this contested geography, conflict, and innovation.
So, moving beyond the general region, when do we see the first, hard evidence of the specific culture we're focusing on, beyond the myths and legends?
Okay, good question. We really need to talk about 2 crucial pieces of archaeological evidence. First, Jericho.
In the Jordan River Valley.
That's the one. Jericho is just this incredible symbol of continuity. It's one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the entire world.
How old are we talking?
We're talking 11 millennia, 11,000 years. Archaeologists have found evidence of massive defensive walls, monumental towers, right from its earliest periods. It tells you this area has been strategically vital for a very, very long time.
Wow. 11,000 years. That really puts the 3,000 years we're focusing on into perspective, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. But the second piece of evidence is maybe even more directly relevant for us today. The Merneptah stele.
Okay, tell us about that.
This is an Egyptian victory inscription. It dates to the reign of Pharaoh Merneptah, somewhere between 1213 and 1203 BCE, found in Thebes.
And it describes his victories.
Mostly over the Libyans, but then the royal scribe tacked on a few lines about a sort of minor campaign in Canaan.
And this is where we find the first known written mention of Israel.
Yes. It's the line that just jumps out, the first verifiable, non-biblical proof of the name Israel. And what does it say? It reads, "Israel is laid waste, its seed is no more."
Wow. Its seed is no more.
Yeah. And the specific Egyptian hieroglyphs used suggest they were seen as maybe a tribal group, perhaps nomadic, not really a settled state yet.
So the very first time history officially records of people's existence, it's a declaration of their total defeat, Annihilation, even.
Pretty much.
How does that mindset of constant existential threat shape everything that follows, their whole survival story?
I think it shows that their identity right from the get-go was tied up with conflict, with resilience, and with this almost miraculous ability to regenerate despite just overwhelming odds. That pattern destruction, followed by this uncompromising focus on spiritual preservation, it really defines the next 3,000 years.
Okay, let's move into part I then. The genesis of identity, the ancient roots. We have to start with the patriarchs, right? And the foundation of monotheism.
Absolutely. The sources trace the origins of Judaism back to Abraham. He was born in Ur of the Chaldees over Mesopotamia.
And he's the foundational figure.
Undisputed. The narrative describes how he receives this covenant from God, often referred to by that unutterable four-letter name, the Tetragrammaton.
Right, YHWH.
Exactly. And the promise is the land of Canaan for his descendants if he maintains strict monotheism and follows God's word.
And his grandson, Jacob, he's key too.
Very key. Jacob fathers the 12 sons who become the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel. And crucially, he's the one who adopts the name Israel, which apparently means something like one who struggles with God.
Okay, so that lineage leads us straight into the really famous story, Moses and the Exodus. But you mentioned earlier that our sources offer a kind of revisionist, maybe even esoteric view, one that challenges the popular image.
Yeah, we really have to tackle that historical misconception head on. The whole idea that the Israelites were slaves forced to build the Egyptian pyramids.
Like in the movies.
Exactly. It's just not supported by archaeology or, frankly, the specific sources we're looking at. The Great Pyramids were already ancient, thousands of years old, by the time the Hebrews are thought to have migrated to Egypt.
So no Hebrew slaves building pyramids.
The sources are quite emphatic. No Hebrew slaves building monuments.
Okay, so if they weren't slaves being whipped by taskmasters, where were they? How are they living?
They were settled in the fertile northern delta region, the land of Goshen. They were agriculturalists, stock breeders, traders. They'd relocated there, remember, after a really severe 7-year famine, supposedly under the patronage of Joseph, Jacob's son, who'd risen high in Egypt.
So living prosperously.
Comfortably.
That's the picture painted, not some oppressed slave population. Right, that radically changes the whole motivation for the Exodus, doesn't it? If they weren't crying out for rescue, why did God Yahweh send Moses to demand their release? And why those, cataclysmic plagues?
Okay, now this is the absolute core of the revisionist interpretation we found. Yahweh isn't just framed as the one true God. He's presented as a severe, almost terrifying, divine warrior deity who demanded absolute, uncompromising purity.
And his anger wasn't just at the Egyptians.
No. According to this view, his anger was primarily directed at the Hebrews themselves. They had assimilated too well, gotten too comfortable with Egyptian life.
They'd lost their way.
They had basically abandoned their ancestral covenant, started adopting local Egyptian deities, preferring an easy life over their unique, demanding monotheistic faith.
Wow. So the Exodus, it wasn't a simple rescue mission. It was more like an enforced extraction, a purification ritual for people who'd become spiritually corrupt.
Precisely. The sources argue the 7 plagues weren't random. They were carefully directed against the heathens, among the Hebrews who worshipped Egyptian gods. The main target was this widespread syncretism mixing faiths.
And the proof of that is the golden calf incident.
It's the ultimate proof in this narrative. Think about it. Moses comes down from Mount Sinai. He's got the 10 Commandments, the core laws.
And he finds them partying around an idol.
Exactly. They'd melted down their gold jewelry and built an image of Apis, the Egyptian bull god of fertility. It confirmed they were still clinging to the very polytheism Yahweh despised.
And Moses' reaction was intense.
Legendary fury. He smashes the tablets, destroys the calf, and then, crucially, he orders the execution of the apostates.
This was brutal enforcement of monotheism.
It was seen as necessary purification. The sources confirm a massacre. The numbers vary. Some say 3,000, others up to 23,000 people killed that night.
Who was spared?
Only the Levites, the tribe of Moses and Aaron, who stood with Moses and refused to worship the calf, but the consequences went way beyond that single night.
How so?
The entire generation that committed this sin, this act of idolatry, was banned from ever entering the Promised Land. They were condemned to wander the desert for decades, until every last one of them died out.
Ensuring only the next generation, the ones who truly embraced Yahweh's monotheism, could finally enter Canaan.
That's the logic presented. Only those purified by the desert experience could inherit the promise. This severity, this demand for purity, really defined the religion's future.
And it connects to that idea of God's name being unutterable, the tetragrammaton.
Absolutely. The reverence for this unknowable, invisible deity was so profound, so intense, that the four-letter name, YHWH, was forbidden to be spoken aloud except under very specific, rare circumstances by the high priest.
It sets Yahweh completely apart from the other regional gods.
Totally. The Canaanite gods had physical forms, detailed myths, temples full of statues. Yahweh is portrayed as a being of pure mystery, and some of the more esoteric sources we looked at even speculate, perhaps allegorically, perhaps literally, that Yahweh was non-terrestrial in origin, existing outside the familiar earthly sphere. A very different kind of deity.
Okay, so after the desert wandering, Joshua leads the conquests, they settle Canaan, but then things fracture during the era of the judges. What finally forced these scattered 12 tribes to unify under a king?
By the late 11th century BCE, the big external pressure was the Philistines.
Ah, yes, the sea peoples.
Exactly. They were technologically superior. They had iron weapons when the Israelites mostly had bronze. Plus, they had a powerful navy, which let them launch devastating raids on the coastal areas and southern regions.
And the tribes, led by these temporary judges, couldn't handle it alone.
No, the decentralized system just wasn't working against that kind of organized threat. Unity became a matter of sheer military necessity, survival.
Which brings us to Saul, the first king.
Right. Saul was kind of a reluctant king, actually, anointed by the prophet Samuel around 1020 BCE. He had some early successes against enemies like the Ammonites and the Philistines, proving himself.
But his reign didn't end well.
No, it was troubled. The narrative frames it as disobedience to the prophets, to God's will. It ended tragically at Mount Gilboa, a decisive battle lost, and Saul took his own life rather than be captured by the Philistines.
And that opened the door for David.
The shepherd boy who became king. David really ushers in what's often called the Golden Age, even though his personal life was, let's say, complicated.
Scandalous even. But his rise is classic underdog stuff.
Absolutely. Defeating Goliath, whether Goliath was literally 9 feet tall, as some texts claim, or just a heavily armed champion, the story is about David's faith giving him the confidence to win with just a sling stone. Then years as an outlaw, fleeing Saul.
Until he finally becomes king, and he unites all the tribes.
Yes, around 993 BCE. And he does something very smart politically. He establishes Jerusalem, which was sort of geographically neutral, as the new capital, centralizing both the political and the spiritual state.
But you mentioned his personal life, the Bathsheba incident.
Yeah, the sources are very clear that his greatness was definitely marred by personal failings. The affair with Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite, one of his loyal soldiers.
And then arranging Uriah's death in battle.
Exactly. A terrible act. And according to the narrative, this had consequences. It led to strife within his own family, and crucially, God forbade him from building the great temple he dreamed of. That task was limited because of his sin.
So the temple project fell to his son Solomon, born of Bathsheba, interestingly.
Correct. Solomon inherited the throne around 970 BCE. His rule was known mostly for peace, incredible wealth, and these massive building projects.
With the first temple as the absolute centerpiece.
Finished around 957 BCE, built on Mount Moriah in Jerusalem. And this is where one of our more esoteric sources makes a fascinating connection.
What's that?
It notes that David, Solomon's father, had supposedly encountered an extraterrestrial angel on that very spot years earlier. So it links the sacred site directly to a moment of divine or perhaps non-terrestrial contact even before the temple was built.
Interesting. So given that possible interpretation, what did the temple itself symbolize in terms of its architecture, maybe hidden knowledge?
Oh, it was absolutely steeped in symbolism, a repository of esoteric concepts. Its entrance was famously marked by 2 enormous bronze pillars.
Jonan and Boaz.
Exactly. Jonan, meaning he establishes, and Boaz, in his strength. They represented cosmic duality, strength, stability, foundational principles.
And the internal structure.
It was divided into 3 distinct parts. The outer court, Ulam, the holy place, Hekal, and then the innermost chamber, the Holy of Holies of Bir. This 3-part division is seen as a physical manifestation of God's layered presence, and the number 3 itself is deeply sacred.
The Holy of Holies. That's where the Ark of the Covenant was kept.
Supposedly, yes. The ultimate sacred space. It was absolutely forbidden to everyone except the high priest, and even he could only enter once a year on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. The whole design symbolized the ultimate, most sacred dwelling place of Yahweh on earth.
But these huge projects, the temple, palaces, they came at a cost, right?
A huge cost. Heavy taxation and forced labor, often levied disproportionately on the northern tribes. This built up deep resentment, which basically set the stage for the next great tragedy, the kingdom fracturing apart.
And fracture is exactly where we pick up in part 2. Exile, Hellenism, and then the Roman storm. So Solomon dies, and his son Rehoboam takes over.
And the northern tribes immediately petition him. Your father's yoke was heavy, lighten it, and we will serve you.
But Rehoboam refuses, listens to his younger, maybe less wise advisors.
He does. He basically tells them, my little finger is thicker than my father's waist. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions. Not exactly diplomatic.
Yeah, not the best way to win friends.
That refusal was the immediate catalyst. 10 northern tribes just seceded on the spot. They formed the Kingdom of Israel, making Jeroboam their king.
Leaving the southern kingdom of Judah, basically the tribes of Judah and Benjamin loyal to Rehoboam, still based in Jerusalem.
Correct. But now you have 2 successor states, both significantly weaker politically and militarily than Solomon's United Kingdom had been.
And weaker means vulnerable to the big empires nearby. Starting with the northern kingdom, Israel.
Israel fell first. They were conquered by the very aggressive Assyrian Empire in 722 BCE. After a brutal 3-year siege of their capital, Samaria, the Assyrians did what they usually did.
Mass deportation.
Exactly. They scattered the population across their vast empire. These became the legendary lost tribes of Israel. Their distinct identity was largely absorbed and disappeared over time.
And the southern kingdom, Judah, it lasted longer.
It managed to survive the Assyrian onslaught, partly through diplomacy, partly through luck. But they eventually fell to the next regional superpower, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, led by King Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BCE.
And this was the huge turning point, the destruction of Jerusalem.
Total destruction, the razing of Solomon's first temple to the ground, and the exile of the Judean elite, the priests, scribes, artisans, leaders to Babylon.
That must have felt like the absolute end, an existential crisis.
Completely. If God's presence was tied to the temple and the temple is gone, how does your faith survive? How does your identity survive?
But it did survive. How?
The sources really emphasize that the community, led by prophets like Ezekiel and Jeremiah, even from afar, and emerging scribes, managed to endure by clinging rigorously to their covenant, their laws, their traditions, practicing their faith even in captivity.
So this forced shift away from temple ritual towards text and community.
It turned out to be the ultimate historical preparation for the much longer diaspora that was still to come. They learned to carry their identity within them, in their scrolls and their practices.
And then, a generation or so later, rescue comes from an unexpected source. The Persians.
Right. The Persian king, Cyrus the Great, conquered Babylon in 539 BCE. And unlike the Assyrians or Babylonians, Cyrus had this remarkable policy of religious tolerance.
He let conquered peoples keep their gods and customs.
Largely, yes. And specifically for the Jews, he issued a decree allowing them to return to Judea, and not just allowing them, but actually authorizing and even providing funds for the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem.
Wow, so that kicks off the Second Temple era.
It does. Construction wasn't immediate, there were delays, but the Second Temple was finally finished and dedicated around 516 BCE.
But you're saying the real importance of this period isn't just the physical building, it's more about the intellectual foundation being laid.
Absolutely. That transition is completely foundational for the long-term survival of Judaism. And the key figure here is Ezra the scribe, or Ezra the writer.
He led a second wave of returning exiles.
Yes, a bit later than the first returnees. Ezra was a priest and a scholar, deeply learned in the law of Moses. He's often called the father of Judaism because his mission was essentially to codify everything.
Formalizing the Torah, the first 5 books.
Exactly. Formalizing the Torah, the Pentateuch, and also canonizing vast amounts of oral tradition and law through what became known as the Great Assembly, or Anshe Knesset Haggadah. The focus shifted decisively away from just temple sacrifice towards textual adherence, study, and interpretation.
And this intellectual shift, focusing on the text, that's where the synagogue comes in.
Precisely. Synagogues likely started developing during the Babylonian exile as places for communal gathering and prayer when the temple wasn't accessible. But they really cemented their role during the Second Temple period. They became these crucial centers for learning, for reading the codified laws, for prayer outside the temple precinct.
So it created this architecture of faith, the law and the synagogue.
That's a great way to put it. And critically, this architecture was portable. It allowed Jewish identity and community to survive without a central temple, which, as history would show, proved absolutely essential just a few centuries later.
Because just as they're codifying their law under relatively benign Persian rule, another conqueror arrives.
Alexander the Great. sweeping through, conquering the entire Persian Empire starting around 336 BCE. This ushers in the Hellenistic period.
Greek culture spreading everywhere.
Yeah, Greek language, philosophy, art, political ideas blending with the East. For many Jews, particularly the elite, Hellenization offered opportunities, integration, maybe progress. But for others,
It was a threat, an existential cultural threat.
exactly, a threat that came to a boiling point under one of Alexander's successor kings, the Seleucid ruler Antiochus V Epiphanes.
He tried to force Hellenization.
He took really extreme measures. Antiochus outlawed core Jewish religious practices, Sabbath observance, circumcision, dietary laws. But the ultimate outrage, the absolute desecration, was when he erected an altar dedicated to Zeus inside the Second Temple itself.
That crossed a spiritual red line.
Completely.
Yeah.
And it ignited the Maccabean revolt.
Led by Judah McCabe, Judah the Hammer.
That's him. It was a fierce, determined guerrilla resistance against a much larger professional army. And remarkably, they succeeded in securing a fragile period of autonomy and, crucially, recapturing and restoring the temple in 164 BCE.
In that event, the rededication of the temple, that's what's celebrated today as Hanukkah.
That's the historical event behind Hanukkah, the Festival of Lights, yes. But sadly, the internal divisions within the Hasmonean dynasty that the Maccabees established, that created an opening.
An opening for the next big power rising in the West.
Rome. Internal squabbles among the Hasmonean princes basically invited Roman intervention. The Roman general Pompey besieged Jerusalem in 63 BCE, effectively ending Jewish independence and turning Judea into a Roman client state.
And the most famous, or maybe infamous, Roman client king was Herod the Great.
Herod, yeah, he was a complex figure. On one hand, a masterful builder. He undertook these absolutely massive construction projects.
Like the huge expansion of the Second Temple itself.
Exactly, making it far grander than before. Plus, Masada, the port city of Caesarea Maritima, hoping these projects would win him favor and legitimize his rule.
But his subjects hated him.
Fiercely, for his heavy taxation, his legendary cruelty, and his absolute subservience to Rome. Now, the famous story of the massacre of the innocents ordering the killing of infants in Bethlehem to eliminate a potential rival king.
That's not historically confirmed outside the Gospels.
No independent historical verification exists, but his reputation for brutality was absolutely real and well-deserved.
Okay, so it's during Herod's reign in this incredibly tense, politically explosive environment that Jesus of Nazareth is born. And our sources spend quite a bit of time on the esoteric interpretations of Jesus, specifically the Gnostic view.
Yes, the Gnostic Gospels texts, like those discovered at Nag Hammadi in Egypt in the 1940s, offer a really powerful alternative perspective to the canonical New Testament narrative.
How do they present Jesus differently?
They present him not just as a savior in the traditional sense, but primarily as a revealer of gnosis.
Gnosis meaning hidden knowledge.
Exactly. Hidden, direct, experiential knowledge of the divine. And this gnosis was seen as essential for true spiritual liberation. But it wasn't something meant for the masses, it was layered.
And you mentioned this structure of teaching mirrors the temple's structure.
It does, remarkably so. The Gnostic tradition, as noted even by early Orthodox Christian writers like Clement of Alexandria, who argued against it, suggested Jesus had these three levels of teaching.
What were they?
First, the public parables and stories for everyone. Second, deeper spiritual truths reserved for a small inner circle of initiates only. And third, a most exalted level of understanding, the highest mysteries that could perhaps only be transmitted non-verbally or through direct experience.
Like the temple, the outer court, the holy place, and the Holy of Holies.
It's a striking parallel, this intellectual or spiritual segregation mirroring the physical segregation of the temple space.
So what was the radical core of this gnosis, this hidden wisdom they believed Jesus revealed?
Well, the Gnostics fundamentally challenged the nature of the God worshipped by mainstream Judaism and emerging Orthodox Christianity. They believed the true God was distant, unknowable, infinite, perhaps akin to the Ein Sof, we'll discuss later in Kabbalah.
And the God of the Old Testament, the Creator God.
They saw that figure, the one who created the physical earth, gave the commandments, judged humanity as a lesser, flawed deity, sometimes called the demiurge, ignorant or even malevolent, trapping divine sparks within flawed material bodies.
So Jesus' role in this view was to show humanity how to bypass this flawed creator.
Exactly. To reveal how humans could access the true divine light, the divine spark already within themselves, and ultimately escape the control of the demiurge and the flawed material world he created.
And this view also changed the role of figures like Mary Magdalene.
Significantly. Many Gnostic texts, like the Gospel of Mary, portray her not just as a follower, but as the disciple closest to Jesus, the one who understood his most profound teachings, often receiving special revelations that the male apostles didn't grasp, a much more elevated status.
Okay, fascinating alternative view. But regardless of whether people follow Jesus or the more militant zealots, the Jewish population eventually clashed violently with Rome.
Oh, inevitably. Resentment over Roman rule, the heavy taxation, the constant presence of legions, the cultural clashes, it all boiled over. The First Jewish-Roman War kicked off in 66 AD. The Zealots, who wanted total independence at any cost, really drove the resistance.
And the Roman response?
Utterly brutal and catastrophic, led by the general Titus, who would later become emperor. The siege of Jerusalem was long and horrific, and it culminated in the total destruction of the city and, crucially, the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD.
The temple Herod had so lavishly expanded.
Gone. Leveled. The only significant part of the temple complex left standing was a section of the outer retaining wall, what we know today as the Western Wall. It became the most sacred site in Judaism precisely because it was the last remnant, a powerful symbol of loss and endurance.
That moment, the destruction of the central sanctuary for the second time, it really should have been the end for Jewish identity, shouldn't it? Removing the physical heart of their religion and nationhood.
Logically, yes. It was an unparalleled disaster that truly forced the global diaspora. There was one last, desperate attempt at regaining sovereignty, the Bar Kokhba revolt, starting in 132 AD.
Led by Simon Bar Kokhba, who some even hailed as the Messiah.
They did. But it was crushed by the Romans with merciless efficiency. And after that, Rome actively sought to erase any memory of Jewish sovereignty. They renamed the province itself.
From Judea to Syria.
To Syria-Palestina, deliberately invoking the name of the ancient enemies, the Philistines. And they banned Jews entirely from entering Jerusalem, which they rebuilt as a Roman city called Aelia Capitolina.
Erasing the name, erasing the present.
Exactly. However, and this is crucial for understanding their survival, the sources remind us that the groundwork laid earlier, the rabbinic Judaism codified by Ezra and tested during the Babylonian exile, allowed their identity, their law, their traditions to survive even this catastrophic loss.
Because they carried it with them. In the portable structure of the synagogue and the absolute centrality of the written word, the Torah.
Precisely. The temple was gone, the land was renamed, but the intellectual and spiritual framework endured, ready for the long 2 millennia of statelessness that lay ahead.
Okay, so that brings us into part 3, the diaspora world and the arcane. We're covering that vast stretch of time, roughly 2 millennia without a state. After the Romans, the region came under new management.
Right. First came the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, which was Christian, centered on Constantinople. Under them, Jerusalem was redefined again, now as a major Christian holy city, Aelia Capitolina.
And what did that mean for the Jewish population still living in the region?
It meant new restrictions. They faced bans on holding administrative positions in the government, severe limits on their ability to build new synagogues or even repair old ones. Life was generally lived under a cloud of institutionalized suspicion and discrimination as the killers of Christ.
But this situation changed again with the next major power shift.
Yes, dramatically, with the wave of Islamic conquest that swept through the region in the 7th century CE.
How did life change under Muslim rule?
Generally speaking, the Islamic conquest actually improved the position of the Jewish communities compared to Byzantine rule, though it was still very much a regulated existence. Under the caliphates, Jews were classified, alongside Christians, as al-Kitab.
People of the book.
Exactly, which meant they were considered followers of earlier, recognized prophets like Abraham and Moses. This granted them a protected status known as dhimmi.
What did dhimmi status entail? Protection, but...
Protection of their lives, their property, and their right to practice their faith, which was a significant improvement. But they had to pay a special poll tax, the jizya, which non-Muslims paid, and they were subject to a number of social restrictions designed to mark them as subordinate.
What kinds of daily restrictions are we talking about under dhimmi status?
Well, the rules varied a bit by time and place, but typically they couldn't build synagogues taller than mosques. They're often banned from riding horses, only donkeys or carrying weapons. Sometimes specific clothing was required. Access to high administrative posts was usually restricted. The goal was always to underscore their secondary, non-dominant status within Islamic society.
But despite those limitations...
Despite the limitations, it was often a stable and predictable legal status. Crucially, they were generally allowed to return to Jerusalem, which had been forbidden under the late Romans and Byzantines. And in certain places and times, they were allowed to participate quite fully in economic and intellectual life.
And that participation led to an incredible cultural flowering, particularly in Spain.
Oh, absolutely. The golden age of Jewish culture in Spain, or Al-Andalus, as it was known under Muslim rule, was truly a remarkable high point of intellectual and cultural collaboration. Jewish communities flourished there for centuries.
Producing major figures.
World-changing figures. Poets like Yehuda Halevi, philosophers and physicians like the great Maimonides, they made monumental contributions, not just to Jewish thought, but to medicine, astronomy, philosophy in general. They often played a key role in translating Greek and Arabic philosophical and scientific texts into Latin, which helped transmit that knowledge back into Christian Europe and arguably helped spark Europe's own Renaissance later on.
It's striking to contrast that intellectual flourishing in Al-Andalus with what was happening to Jewish communities in medieval Christendom around the same time.
Yeah, the contrast is stark. As Christianity consolidated its power across Europe, Jews became increasingly and systematically marginalized, pushed to the fringes of society.
How so? What were the mechanisms?
Well, they were generally barred from owning land in most places, excluded from the feudal system. They couldn't join the craft guilds that controlled most trades. This exclusion often forced them, almost by default, into roles like local merchants, traders between regions, and especially money lending.
Because the church forbade Christians from charging interest, usury.
Exactly. The church had strict prohibitions against usury for Christians, so Jewish communities often filled this necessary economic niche, providing credit. But this made them both indispensable to the economy and deeply resented. They became this highly visible, often relatively wealthy, yet politically powerless and vulnerable minority.
And that resentment easily boiled over into hostility, violent hostility.
Very easily, and often encouraged by both religious and secular authorities. The invention and spread of the absolutely notorious blood libel was a key factor here.
That's the horrific accusation about using Christian children's blood.
Yes, the utterly false, baseless accusation that Jews murdered Christian children, usually around Easter or Passover, to use their blood in religious rituals. This grotesque fantasy spread like wildfire across Europe for centuries, fueling virulent hatred and providing the justification for countless persecutions, pogroms, and expulsions.
And this environment just exploded during the Crusades.
The Crusades, starting in 1096, were a catastrophe for European Jewry, especially the very first wave, the so-called People's Crusade.
That was the unofficial one, led by figures like Peter the Hermit.
Right, it was basically mobs of peasants and minor knights fired up with a religious fervor to liberate the Holy Land from the Muslims. But before they even got close to Jerusalem, they decided to start the cleansing closer to home.
Meaning attacks on Jewish communities in Europe?
Exactly. They marched through the Rhineland and along the Danube, massacring entire Jewish communities in cities like Mainz, Worms, and Speyer. It was an immediate horror show.
And when the official, more organized crusaders finally reached Jerusalem,
the violence was indiscriminate and even more horrific. When they breached the walls of Jerusalem in 1099, they slaughtered tens of thousands of the city's inhabitants, Muslims and Jews alike. Contemporary accounts describe crusaders wading ankle-deep in blood. And there's the particularly chilling account of them rounding up Jerusalem's Jewish inhabitants, forcing them into the main synagogue, and then burning it down with everyone trapped inside.
Just unimaginable brutality. And this atmosphere of relentless persecution in Christian Europe eventually reached a kind of climax in Spain, ironically the former center of the Golden Age.
Yes, after the Christian Reconquista gradually pushed the Muslims out, the tide turned dramatically against Spain's Jews. In 1492, the same year Columbus sailed, the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, issued the Alhambra Decree,
forcing Jews to choose, convert or leave.
Convert to Catholicism or face immediate exile. Tens, maybe hundreds of thousands fled, many finding refuge in the more tolerant Ottoman Empire, North Africa, or Italy. But many others chose or were forced to convert publicly while trying to maintain their Jewish identity in secret. This became known as Crypto-Judaism.
And the sources mention that Maimonides, the great rationalist philosopher from the Golden Age centuries earlier, had actually provided a kind of theological justification for this.
He did, interestingly enough. Facing brutal persecution himself from extremist Almohad Muslims in North Africa much earlier, Maimonides argued that in situations of extreme danger, seeking martyrdom was not always required or even advisable. He essentially decreed that it was permissible for Jews to outwardly conform to the dominant faith, Islam in his case, later Catholicism in Spain, while maintaining their true covenant with God in secret, in their hearts and private practices.
So he saw crypto-Judaism not as betrayal, but as an act of survival, spiritual heroism.
Pretty much. He argued it was better to live and keep the commandments secretly than to die or fully abandon the faith. This ruling undoubtedly saved countless lives during the horrors of the Spanish Inquisition, which relentlessly hunted down these conversos or Marranos suspected of practicing Judaism in secret.
And there's that anecdote about how they maintain traditions secretly, the Sinisterca.
Right. It's a really clever and kind of poignant example. To celebrate the Jewish festival of Purim, which commemorates the story of Queen Esther saving the Jews, without arousing the Inquisition's suspicion, some crypto-Jews apparently invented a fictional Catholic saint, Santa Esther, or Santa Sterica, and held feasts and celebrations on her Saint's Day, which just happened to coincide with Purim. A remarkable act of cultural subterfuge and resilience.
This incredible need for resilience, for secrecy, for carrying identity internally, it seems so closely tied to that shift away from the physical temple towards codified texts and internal belief.
It really is.
And speaking of deep intellectual traditions, the Middle Ages, particularly in places like Spain and southern France, saw the profound development of Jewish mysticism, the Kabbalah.
Yes, Kabbalah emerged as the esoteric, mystical dimension of Judaism. It wasn't really about the legalistic side, but sought to understand the deepest mysteries, the nature of God, the creation of the universe, the destiny of the soul. It tried to explain the profound, maybe even terrifying, relationship between the infinite, unknowable God, whom the Kabbalists often termed Ein Sof, meaning without end, or the infinite.
And the finite universe he created.
Exactly. How could a mortal, finite human possibly connect with or comprehend an utterly infinite, transcendent Godhead? How did creation even happen from this infinite source? These were the huge questions Kabbalah wrestled with.
And the central text of this tradition, appearing in the 13th century, is the Zohar.
The Zohar, or Book of Splendor. It's an incredibly rich, complex, often allegorical commentary on the Torah, discussing cosmology, the nature of souls, divine emanations, good and evil. Just vast.
But here's where we loop back to that esoteric theme you mentioned at the start. Some modern interpretations see more than just mysticism in the Zohar.
Right. This is fascinating. Modern scholarly interpretations, particularly those put forward by figures like Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan, who was interestingly also a trained physicist in the 20th century, suggest that the Zohar contains passages that can be interpreted as specific evidence of, well, extraterrestrial life.
Wow, extraterrestrial life in a medieval Jewish mystical text. That's a pretty bold claim. How is that interpreted?
Kaplan and others point to passages in the Zohar that explicitly describe the existence of 7 distinct Earths, or worlds, separated by firmaments or dimensions. And crucially, the text says that each of these other Earths is inhabited by intelligent creatures.
Creatures who aren't human.
Apparently not. Beings who possess some understanding of God and creation, but are demonstrably different from humans. This goes way beyond the standard medieval cosmology, which was very Earth-centric. It suggests a much vaster populated universe, challenging the scope of traditional religious texts.
And this mystical knowledge, this cosmology, is often represented visually by that famous diagram, the Tree of Life.
The Kabbalistic Tree of Life, yes. It's essentially a map of creation, a diagram showing how divine energy flows down from the infinite Ein Sof into the created world. It features 10 spheres, called the Sephirot.
Which represent?
They represent the 10 stages or emanations or attributes through which the infinite God manifests himself into the finite physical world. Things like wisdom, chokhmah, understanding, bina, mercy, chesed, judgment, gevurah, beauty, tiferet, down to kingdom malkuth, which represents the physical world.
And these spheres are connected by paths?
22 paths, corresponding to the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And crucially, the entire diagram, the whole structure, is often depicted as being supported by 2 pillars.
Yachin and Boaz, from Solomon's temple.
The very same, pulled directly from the symbolic architecture of the first temple. It creates this incredible intellectual and symbolic link between the physical temple that was destroyed and this vast abstract map of the cosmos and the divine.
So the Tree of Life is like a spiritual blueprint.
Exactly. But some esoteric interpretations take it even further. They view the Tree of Life not just as a spiritual or psychological map, but as a potential cosmic pathway, maybe even a schematic representation of the route that ancient astronauts, or perhaps divine beings, used to travel between Earth and the heavens, interacting with humanity.
Wow. So the hidden wisdom, maybe hinted at in the temple's design, was carried, amplified, and protected through texts like the Zohar during those 2 millennia of statelessness and persecution.
That's one way to look at it. It really illustrates that perhaps the greatest survival mechanism wasn't military might or political power, but this deep, portable, adaptable, intellectual, and spiritual tradition.
Okay, let's transition now into part 4. We're moving into the modern era, which really kicks off with the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. And this brought massive changes for Jews, particularly in Western Europe emancipation rights.
Yes, this was a period of absolutely incredible, rapid social transformation. Emancipation, starting in France and spreading gradually, allowed many Jews to finally move out of the restricted ghettos or confined areas where they'd often been forced to live.
And move into the mainstream.
Into the major Western megacities, Vienna, Berlin, Paris, London. And they excelled incredibly quickly, moving into professions that had often been closed to them: banking, medicine, law, journalism, academia, the arts. It really offered this profound promise of assimilation, of finally belonging as equal citizens.
But that promise, it wasn't fully realized, was it? It was met almost immediately by this rising, kind of insidious counterforce, modern anti-Semitism.
That's the essential and ultimately tragic shift that happens in the 19th century. Prejudice starts morphing. It stops being purely religious, the old "we hate Jews because they rejected, killed Christ" argument, although that certainly didn't disappear.
It becomes racial, political.
Yeah, exactly. It becomes, we hate Jews because they are a distinct, alien, biologically inferior race. Or, we hate Jews because they are secretly manipulating finance, politics, media to achieve world domination. Jews, having moved rapidly into the new urban professional middle class, became this convenient, highly visible scapegoat for nationalists and populists trying to explain the confusing upheavals of industrialization, capitalism, and economic panics in the late 19th century.
And the tipping point, especially for Jewish consciousness in Eastern Europe, was the devastating wave of pogroms.
Absolutely. These weren't just isolated incidents. They were widespread, often state-sanctioned or at least tolerated massacres and riots, particularly in the Russian Empire under the Tsars. Acts of pure terror. Synagogues torched, homes and businesses looted, communities brutalized or wiped out. It showed the utter precariousness of Jewish life there.
And at the same time, even in supposedly enlightened Western Europe, the illusion of safety and assimilation was being shattered.
Completely shattered by the Dreyfus affair in France.
Captain Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish artillery officer in the French army, falsely accused of treason in 1894.
Right. The evidence against him was flimsy, later proven to be entirely forged. Yet the military establishment, fueled by virulent anti-Semitic elements in the press and political circles, railroaded him. His public degradation ceremony, where his sword was broken and medals ripped off, it was a national spectacle.
And the country was torn apart over it.
France was deeply divided. The affair proved, even in the birthplace of liberty, equality, fraternity, that a Jew, no matter how patriotic or assimilated, could never truly be considered fully French, always suspected of dual loyalty. For many Jews watching, the failure of the assimilationist dream was undeniable and terrifying.
And it's this profound realization that safety and acceptance couldn't be guaranteed anywhere that gives birth to the modern political movement of Zionism.
Precisely. And the key architect, the visionary, was Theodor Herzl.
Who was he? A politician? A rabbi?
Neither, actually. He was a secular, assimilated, Austro-Hungarian Jewish journalist and playwright. He was living in Paris, covering the Dreyfus affair for his Vienna newspaper, and witnessing Dreyfus's degradation and the sheer hatred on display. It was a conversion experience for him.
He concluded that relying on the goodwill of host nations was a mistake.
A fatal error. He became convinced that the only solution to the Jewish question, the only way to guarantee security and survival, was for Jews to have their own sovereign homeland, a nation-state of their own.
And Herzl didn't just theorize, he acted. He convened the first Zionist Congress.
Immediately, he threw himself into organizing. In 1897, he brought together Jewish delegates from all over the world in Basel, Switzerland, and they set the clear public goal to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine, Eretz Israel, the ancient homeland secured under international law.
That sounds incredibly ambitious for the time.
It was audacious. Herzl himself captured this almost prophetic optimism in his personal diaries around the time of the Congress. He famously wrote something like, "At Basel, I founded the Jewish state. If I said this out loud today, I would be answered by universal laughter. Perhaps in 5 years, and certainly in 50, everyone will know it."
Wow, and he was off by only 1 year. 51 years later, Israel was declared.
Quite remarkable foresight, or maybe just sheer will.
However, the actual return to the land, the practical groundwork,
Yeah,
That had already started happening before Herzl's political movement really took off, right? Driven more by desperation.
Absolutely. That was the first Aliyah, the first major wave of immigration, which started around 1882. These weren't primarily political Zionists in Herzl's mold yet. They were largely religious Jews or simply desperate refugees fleeing the pogroms in Russia and Eastern Europe.
Driven by necessity? Or maybe that ancient religious hope of returning to Zion?
Both. And they began establishing the first modern, permanent Jewish agricultural settlements. Places like Rishon LeZion, Petah Tikva is incredibly difficult work, draining swamps, farming arid land.
And this early wave depended heavily on outside help.
Critically, it was only possible thanks to the massive financial and logistical support of wealthy Jewish philanthropists, most famously Baron Edmond de Rothschild from the French banking family. He poured millions into funding land purchases, infrastructure, training, basically keeping these fledgling communities alive in the early, very difficult years.
Okay, so you have the ideological movement building with Herzl and the practical settlement starting on the ground. What created the big geopolitical opportunity for this dream to potentially become reality?
World War I. Specifically, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, which had ruled Palestine for 400 years.
Because the Ottomans sided with Germany and the Central Powers?
Exactly. That made Palestine, which satisfied crucial land routes and was close to the Suez Canal, a key strategic prize for the Allies, particularly Britain. While the secret 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement was already carving up the Ottoman territories between Britain and France.
Something else happened publicly.
Yes. The pivotal diplomatic moment came in November 1917 with the issuance of the Balfour Declaration.
A short letter from the British Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour, to Lord Rothschild, a leader of the British Jewish community.
Correct. And this short, carefully worded but ultimately explosive document stated that the British government viewed with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people.
A national home. Not explicitly a state, but a huge step.
A monumental promise. Britain had complex motivations for issuing it. First, definitely strategic, securing influence in a vital region near the Suez Canal after the war. Second, they genuinely hoped to gain Jewish support for the Allied war effort, particularly in Russia and America. And third, there was a connection with influential Zionist leaders, especially Chaim Weizmann.
Weizmann was a chemist.
Yes, a brilliant chemist whose scientific work on acetone production was actually vital to the British munitions industry during the war.
Yeah.
This gave him access and influence at the highest levels.
But the Balfour Declaration, as our sources really emphasize, contained a fundamental, maybe fatal contradiction from the start.
He really did.
Yeah.
While it promised support for a Jewish national home, it also included a caveat that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine.
The Arab population, who are the vast majority at the time.
Overwhelmingly the majority.
Yeah.
So Britain essentially promised the same land, or at least control over its destiny, to two different groups with conflating national aspirations without properly consulting the existing Arab population.
So it immediately baked conflict into the situation.
It created an almost instantly irreconcilable conflict. It set the stage for the next century of struggle between two national movements competing for the same small piece of land, the Arab nationalism that was already developing in the region, and the political Zionism now fueled by both ancient dreams and the urgent modern necessity of escaping persecution.
Which leads us directly into Part 5. This covers the absolute darkest chapter, the Holocaust, the Shoah, which tragically confirmed for the survivors that statehood wasn't just a political dream, it was an absolute existential necessity. We really need to understand the roots of Hitler's specific, obsessive anti-Semitism.
It's crucial, though deeply disturbing. Hitler's hatred seems to have been forged during his youth, his struggling artist years in Vienna, before World War I.
Vienna was a real melting pot of ideas then, including some toxic ones.
Absolutely. It was intellectually vibrant, but also a hotbed of radical German nationalism and rising anti-Semitism. Hitler was deeply influenced by pan-German nationalist figures like Georg von Schöner, but maybe even more importantly, by the hugely popular and openly anti-Semitic mayor of Vienna, Karl Lueger.
Lueger, why was he so significant for Hitler's development?
Because Luger demonstrated very effectively that anti-Semitism could be weaponized for political success. He wasn't just appealing to old religious prejudices, he skillfully channeled the social and economic anxieties of the lower middle classes, artisans, small shopkeepers, by blaming Jews for the perceived evils of both big capitalism and Marxism.
Portraying them as this alien force disrupting traditional life.
Exactly. This potent blend of economic, social, and traditional religious anti-Semitism built Luger a massively successful political base. Hitler, writing later in Mein Kampf, explicitly admired Luger's populist techniques and called him the greatest German mayor of all time. He learned that Jew hatred could win votes.
And yet, amidst this developing hatred, the sources point out a really profound, almost bizarre contradiction. Hitler apparently protected his mother's Jewish physician, Dr. Edward Bloch.
It's a documented and striking exception. Dr. Bloch, who was known in Linz as the doctor of the poor, had treated Hitler's mother, Clara, during her final battle with breast cancer. Hitler was devastated by her death, but remained deeply grateful to Bloch.
He expressed this gratitude.
Yes, sending Bloch hand-painted postcards and expressing his everlasting gratitude. Later, after the Nazis annexed Austria in 1938, Hitler personally intervened to ensure Bloch and his wife were protected from persecution, received special treatment, and were even assisted in emigrating to the United States in 1940.
What does that tell us? That his hatred wasn't absolute?
I think it proves the opposite in a way. It shows he was capable of personal gratitude towards an individual Jew he knew. But it didn't also his rigid systemic ideological commitment to racial anti-Semitism as a political program. The exception highlights the rule of his unwavering abstract hatred of Jews as a group.
Okay, so after his Vienna years, Hitler fights in World War I for Germany. And Germany's defeat becomes another crucial element in his worldview.
Absolutely central. He fully embraced the poisonous stab-in-the-back myth, the Dolchstoßlegende.
This was the conspiracy theory promoted by some German military leaders like Hindenburg and Ludendorff.
Yes. The theory claimed that the German army hadn't actually been defeated on the battlefield in 1918. It was betrayed, stabbed in the back, by traitorous politicians, especially socialists and Democrats, and Jewish elements on the home front, the so-called November criminals who signed the armistice and established the Weimar Republic.
Even though it was the military leadership itself that told the government the war was lost.
Precisely. It was a self-serving lie designed to deflect blame. But Hitler internalized it completely. It became a central pillar of his Nazi propaganda, used relentlessly to demonize the Weimar Republic, democracy itself, and especially German Jews, portraying them as inherently disloyal and destructive.
And to give this hatred a kind of pseudo-intellectual justification, he relied heavily on a notorious forgery.
The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Even though this text, originally fabricated by the Tsarist Russian secret police around 1903, had already been exposed worldwide as a crude hoax.
It claimed to be the secret minutes of a meeting of Jewish leaders plotting world domination.
Exactly. Controlling global finance, manipulating the media, orchestrating wars and revolutions. All the classic anti-Semitic tropes rolled into one. Hitler read it, believed it, or at least found it incredibly useful. He cited it in Mein Kampf, claiming it revealed the true nature and ultimate goals of the Jewish people. It confirmed his paranoid worldview.
And this toxic mix, the Vienna influence, the war trauma, the conspiracy theories, culminated in one of his earliest written statements outlining his intentions before he even had real political power.
That would be the Gimlich letter, written in 1919 when he was still just a minor army political agent. In this letter, he tries to distinguish his supposedly rational anti-Semitism based on race from simple emotional anti-Semitism based on pogroms.
What did he mean by rational anti-Semitism?
He argued that Judaism wasn't a religion, but a race, a dangerous foreign body within the German nation whose ultimate goal was money and world domination. And because of this inherent racial threat, he argued, the final goal of a strong government must be the uncompromising elimination, and ferning of the Jews altogether.
Elimination and ferning, that German word.
It was a bit vague at the time. Could it mean just removal, expulsion?
It could be interpreted that way initially, yes. Expulsion or total segregation. But the core intent was absolute removal, solving the Jewish problem permanently and radically. The seeds of genocide were clearly there, even in 1919.
Okay, so he takes power in 1933. How does the Nazi state then transition from this ideology of elimination to the actual systematic implementation of violence and murder?
The escalation was chillingly methodical, cold, and calculated. It wasn't immediate extermination. First came legal and social death.
The Nuremberg Laws. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 were key. They institutionalized the Nazis' racial theories. They stripped Jews of their German citizenship, forbade marriage or any relationships between Jews and non-Jewish Germans, and systematically excluded Jews from public life, professions, schools, pushing them into a state of complete legal and social isolation, making them pariahs in their own homeland.
And then the state-sanctioned violence became overt, with
Kristallnacht.
Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, in November 1938. The assassination of a minor German diplomat in Paris by Herschel Grinspan, a desperate young Polish Jew whose family had been deported, was used as the pretext.
But it wasn't a spontaneous outburst of anger.
Not at all. It was a carefully orchestrated, state-sanctioned pogrom unleashed across Germany and Austria. Nazi stormtroopers and mobs were given free rein. Over 1,400 synagogues were burned or destroyed. Thousands of Jewish-owned businesses were smashed and looted. Homes were vandalized. And critically, around 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and dragged off to the first concentration camps, Dachau, Buchenwald.
So Kristallnacht was a test. It was the regime testing the waters, seeing how far they could go with public violence, gauging public reaction, and signaling a radical escalation. It marked the shift from legal discrimination to open physical terror.
But the truly industrialized, systematic genocide, the final solution, began later, especially after the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941.
Yes, the invasion of the USSR brought millions more Jews under Nazi control, and it seems to have been the trigger for the decision to move towards total physical extermination. Initially, this was carried out largely by mobile killing squads, the Einsatzgruppen, who followed the army and conducted mass shootings of Jewish civilians, men, women, and children into pits. Hundreds of thousands were murdered this way.
That wasn't efficient enough for them.
Apparently not. It was also psychologically taxing on the killers. So the regime sought a more impersonal, industrialized method. This led to the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, chaired by Reinhard Heydrich.
Heydrich, often called the architect of the final solution.
He was tasked with coordinating it. The Wannsee Conference didn't decide on the genocide. That decision seems to have been made earlier at the highest levels, by Hitler and Himmler. But Wannsee was about coordinating the bureaucracy, the logistics, of implementing the final solution to the Jewish question across all of occupied Europe.
And this involved
Deporting Jews from all over Europe to purpose-built extermination camps located mainly in occupied Poland, places like Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec. There, they would be systematically murdered, primarily using poison gas in specially designed chambers, and their bodies disposed of in crematoria.
a cold, bureaucratic, industrial process of mass murder.
Unprecedented in its scale and chilling efficiency. In total, 6 million Jewish men, women, and children were systematically murdered in the Holocaust, the Shoah. 2/3 of European Jewry wiped out. Countless communities, centuries of culture obliterated.
And the full devastating extent of this catastrophe, when it became known after the war, it confirmed a terrible truth for the survivors and the Zionist movement.
An undeniable, brutal truth that they could never again rely on the goodwill or protection of other nations or international laws. Assimilation hadn't saved German Jews. International norms hadn't stopped Hitler.
So the Holocaust provided the absolute final confirmation that survival required self-determination, a sovereign state.
Absolutely. It wasn't just a political aspiration anymore. It was an existential imperative. The Zionist argument for a Jewish state capable of defending its own people gained overwhelming moral and political force in the wake of the Shoah. This propelled the drive for statehood with incredible urgency immediately after World War II ended.
And the British, who still held the mandate over Palestine but were exhausted by the war and facing escalating violence between Jews and Arabs there.
They basically washed their hands of the problem. They couldn't control the situation, caught between Jewish militias demanding statehood and Arab resistance. So in 1947, they handed the issue over to the newly formed United Nations.
And the UN came up with a plan.
The UN Special Committee on Palestine, UNESCO, proposed the Partition Plan, Resolution 181, in November 1947. It recommended dividing mandatory Palestine into 2 independent states, one Arab, one Jewish, with the city of Jerusalem placed under a special international regime.
How was the land divided?
The proposed Jewish state was allocated about 55–56% of the land, including the coastal plain and the Negev desert, even though Jews were only about 1/3 of the population at the time. The Arab state got about 43–44%, mostly the Central Highlands, West Bank, and the Gaza area.
How was the plan received?
The Jewish leadership, represented by the Jewish Agency led by David Ben-Gurion, reluctantly accepted the compromise. They didn't get all the land they wanted, especially Jerusalem, but it offered statehood. However, the Arab Higher Committee, represented the Palestinian Arabs, and all the neighboring Arab states rejected the plan outright. They saw it as unjust, giving away Arab land to recent immigrants. They demanded the entire territory.
So partition was accepted by one side, rejected by the other. What happened next?
Violence immediately escalated between Jewish and Arab militias within Palestine. And as the British mandate was set to expire on May 15, 1948, the Jewish leadership decided to act unilaterally.
Declaring independence.
Yes. On May 14, 1948, hours before the mandate officially ended, David Ben-Gurion stood in the Tel Aviv Museum and read out the Declaration of the Establishment of the State of Israel. After nearly 2,000 years, the dream born of ancient prophecy and now forged in the fires of modern necessity and catastrophe was realized.
A moment of incredible triumph and relief.
But that triumph was immediately met by war. The very next day, the armies of 5 neighboring Arab nations invaded the newborn state, determined to destroy it at birth.
Okay, so that declaration immediately plunges us into part 6, war, diplomacy, and how Israel, against the odds, became this technological powerhouse. So May 1948, independence declared, and instantly, war.
Instantly. 5 Arab armies, Egypt, Syria, Transjordan, now Jordan, Lebanon, and Iraq, invaded from all sides. On paper, the odds looked overwhelming against the brand new state of Israel.
The Israeli forces were just forming, not really a professional army yet.
Not at all. The Israel Defense Forces, IDF, was cobbled together literally overnight from various pre-state underground militias like the Haganah, Irgun, and Lehi. They were generally outnumbered, poorly equipped, lacked heavy weapons and aircraft initially.
But they fought with incredible determination.
Fierce determination. For them, this wasn't just a political war. It was a war for sheer survival, fought in the immediate shadow of the Holocaust. Losing wasn't an option. They fought with their backs against the sea, quite literally.
And somehow they won.
Against the odds, they managed to halt the Arab advances and eventually push back. By the time armistice agreements were signed throughout 1949, Israel had not only secured its independence, but had actually expanded its territory significantly beyond the original UN partition lines. They controlled about 78% of mandatory Palestine.
But this victory came at a huge cost, particularly for the other side. This is the Nakba.
Yes, the Nakba, meaning catastrophe in Arabic. The 1948 war resulted in the displacement, or in many cases expulsion, of a huge number of Palestinian Arabs from the territories that became Israel. Estimates vary, but generally range between 700,000 and 750,000 people.
Where did they go?
They fled or were forced into neighboring Arab countries, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and also into the remaining parts of Palestine controlled by Jordan, the West Bank, and Egypt, the Gaza Strip. Most ended up in refugee camps, many of which became permanent settlements existing to this day.
So the war created this massive, unresolved refugee problem.
Absolutely, and it solidified the core conflict for decades to come. Israel focused on absorbing massive waves of Jewish immigrants, Holocaust survivors from Europe, but also hundreds of thousands of Jews fleeing persecution in Arab countries. Meanwhile, the surrounding Arab states remained militantly hostile, refusing to recognize Israel, leading to constant border clashes and military tension.
That tension erupted into another major conflict less than a decade later, the 1956 Suez Crisis.
Right. The trigger was the Egyptian president, Gamal Abdel Nasser. He was a charismatic Arab nationalist leader who, in 1956, nationalized the Suez Canal, which had been controlled by Britain and France.
A vital waterway.
Crucial for global trade.
Yeah.
But Nasser also, critically for Israel, blockaded the Straits of Tiran, which was Israel's only maritime access route to the Red Sea and Asian markets via the port of Eilat.
So Israel saw this as an act of aggression.
A direct threat. So Israel coordinated military action with Britain and France, who were furious about losing control of the canal. Israel launched a swift invasion of the Sinai Peninsula in late October 1956, routing the Egyptian army there.
A military success for Israel.
A stunning military success. They captured the entire Sinai in about a week. But politically, it was a disaster.
How so?
The United States, under President Eisenhower, and the Soviet Union were both strongly opposed to the British and French intervention, seeing it as old-style colonialism. They applied immense diplomatic and economic pressure. Britain and France buckled, and Israel was ultimately forced to withdraw completely from Sinai and Gaza without achieving its political aims, like guaranteed passage through Tiran.
So a military win turns into a geopolitical loss, underscoring their vulnerability to superpower politics.
Exactly. It showed that military prowess alone wasn't enough. But the next major confrontation, in 1967, would dramatically change the map and the psychology of the entire region.
The Six-Day War.
The lead-up was incredibly tense. Arab rhetoric was heating up, armies were mobilizing on Israel's borders, and Nasser again closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping, an act Israel had already stated it would consider a cause for war.
So Israel decided to strike first.
Believing an Arab attack was imminent and potentially devastating, Israel launched a massive preemptive airstrike on the morning of June 5, 1967. In just a few hours, they destroyed the vast majority of the Egyptian Air Force on the ground, followed quickly by attacks on the Syrian and Jordanian air forces,
gaining total air supremacy from the outset,
which proved decisive. In just 6 days of fighting, Israeli ground forces achieved lightning victories on 3 fronts. They routed the combined armies of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan.
And the territorial gains were huge.
Immense. Israel captured the entire Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip from Egypt, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem with the Old City and the Western Wall from Jordan, and the strategically vital Golan Heights from Syria. The size of the territory under Israeli control tripled. It was a shocking, transformative victory.
And that success, especially capturing the Golan Heights, which overlooks northern Israel, the sources link that directly to the incredible work of a Mossad spy, Eli Cohen.
Yes. Eli Cohen's story is legendary in the annals of espionage. He was an Israeli agent who, in the early 1960s, managed to completely infiltrate the highest political and military circles in Syria.
How did he do it?
Posing as Kamal Amin Thaibet, a wealthy Syrian businessman supposedly returning home after living in Argentina. He was charming through lavish parties, cultivated friendships with top generals and politicians. He became so trusted that he was apparently even considered for the position of Deputy Minister of Defense at one point.
And he gathered crucial intelligence.
Invaluable intelligence. He was given tours of Syrian military installations, including their fortifications in the Golan Heights. And here's the famous, almost unbelievable part of the story.
The trees.
The trees. According to the story, Cohen noticed how exposed the Syrian bunkers and gun positions were to the sun. So, with feigned concern for the soldiers' comfort, he suggested planting eucalyptus trees nearby to provide shade. The Syrians actually did it.
Unwittingly marking their own positions for Israeli intelligence.
Exactly. Those trees became perfect markers for Israeli pilots and artillery observers, providing Israel with a devastatingly precise edge when they attacked the Golan Heights during the Six-Day War. Cohen himself was eventually caught and executed by Syria in 1965, but his intelligence is credited with saving countless Israeli lives and contributing significantly to the victory 2 years later.
An incredible story, but despite that stunning 67 victory, Israel's sense of invincibility was profoundly shaken just 6 years later.
Yes, by the Yom Kippur War of 1973. This time, it was Egypt and Syria who launched the surprise attack.
On the holiest day of the Jewish calendar.
Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. A day when the country largely shuts down, people are fasting, praying, many soldiers were on leave. They caught Israel completely by surprise, achieving significant initial breakthroughs on both the Suez Front in the Sinai and the Golan Heights.
So unlike 67, Israel was on the defensive initially.
Very much so. For the first few days, the situation looked dire. There was a genuine fear for the first time since 1948 that the country's actual survival might be threatened.
But they managed to mobilize and turn the tide.
Eventually, yes. After suffering heavy casualties initially, the IDF mobilized its reserves, counterattacked fiercely, pushed the Syrians back beyond the 1967 lines, and even crossed the Suez Canal into Egypt proper, encircling the Egyptian Third Army. Militarily, Israel ultimately won the war.
But the psychological impact was huge.
Immense. The shock of the surprise attack, the high casualty rate, the initial setbacks. It shattered the illusion of easy invincibility that had set in after 1967. It forced a fundamental realization in Israel that the status quo of occupying vast Arab territories wasn't sustainable through military might alone. Endless war was too costly. Genuine diplomacy was now seen as essential.
And that major psychological shift directly resulted in the landmark peace agreement a few years later.
Absolutely. The Yom Kippur War paved the way for the 1978 Camp David Accords.
Brokered by U.S. President Jimmy Carter.
Yes. Carter brought together 2 leaders who had been bitter enemies. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, a former hardliner himself. After intense negotiations at Camp David, they achieved a historic breakthrough.
The first peace treaty between Israel and an Arab nation.
Egypt became the very first Arab country to formally recognize Israel's right to exist and establish full diplomatic relations. In return, Israel agreed to withdraw completely from the entire Sinai Peninsula, returning it to Egypt. It was a monumental achievement, a true land-for-peace deal, though it came at the cost of Sadat's life. He was assassinated a few years later by Egyptian extremists opposed to the peace.
Okay, so peace with Egypt was huge, but simultaneously the Palestinian issue was becoming more organized, more visible globally, under one key figure.
Yasser Arafat. He really transformed the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, from a collection of factions, often dependent on Arab governments, into a more independent, unified political force. He became the undeniable international symbol of the Palestinian cause, representing their suffering, their aspirations for statehood, but also, for Israel and many in the West, representing organized resistance and terrorism.
He was very effective at getting the world's attention.
Extremely. Through a combination of diplomacy at the UN, political maneuvering, and unfortunately also through acts of terror carried out by groups under the PLO umbrella, he forced the Palestinian question onto the international agenda in a way it hadn't been before.
And this eventually led, surprisingly perhaps, to direct, secret negotiations between Israel and the PLO.
Yes, in the early 1990s, facilitated by Norwegian diplomats, secret talks took place in Oslo between Israeli officials and PLO representatives. This led to the stunning breakthrough of the Oslo Accords in 1993.
What did the Oslo Accords agree on?
It was based on mutual recognition. Israel formally recognized the PLO and Arafat as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, and the PLO, in turn, formally recognized Israel's right to exist in peace and security and renounced the use of terrorism.
And it set up a framework for Palestinian self-government.
Yes, it led to the establishment of the Palestinian Authority, PA, which was intended to gradually take over administrative control in parts of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, starting with Jericho and Gaza. It was envisioned as an interim step toward a final peace settlement.
And the image of that moment, the handshake on the White House lawn.
The handshake between Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, a former general, and Yasser Arafat, the longtime enemy, with President Bill Clinton standing between them. It was an incredibly powerful symbol of hope, a moment many thought would never happen. They, along with Israeli Foreign Minister Shimon Peres, were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for it.
But the process wasn't complete. It didn't resolve the toughest issues.
No, crucially, Oslo deliberately postponed the most difficult final status issues: the borders of a future Palestinian state, the status of Jerusalem, claimed by both sides as their capital, the fate of Israeli settlements built in the West Bank and Gaza, and the right of return for Palestinian refugees from 1948. The hope was that building trust through interim steps would make tackling these harder issues possible later.
But that trust never fully materialized. The process stalled.
It stalled, and then, tragically, it was dealt a devastating blow. In November 1995, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated.
Not by a Palestinian, but by
a right-wing Israeli extremist, Yigal Amir, who vehemently opposed the Oslo Accords and giving up land. Rabin's assassination sent shockwaves through Israel and severely damaged the peace camp. It removed the key Israeli leader who had the credibility and political will to push the process forward.
And the lack of progress, continued settlement building, poverty, and frustration on the Palestinian side led to more violence, the intifadas.
Exactly. The first intifada, or uprising, had already occurred in the late 1980s, characterized mostly by protests, strikes, and stone throwing. But the second intifada, which erupted in late 2000, was far bloodier, far more militarized.
What sparked the second intifada?
The immediate trigger is often cited as a provocative visit by Ariel Sharon, then the Israeli opposition leader, to the Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif compound in Jerusalem, a site holy to both Jews and Muslims. But the underlying causes were deeper: the collapse of final status talks, ongoing settlement expansion, and deep frustration among Palestinians.
And this era saw horrific violence.
It was a terrible period, marked by waves of Palestinian suicide bombings targeting Israeli civilians on buses, in cafes, and intense Israeli military responses, incursions into Palestinian cities, targeted killings. The cycle of violence led directly to Israel's decision to construct the massive West Bank barrier, or wall.
A physical separation.
A very controversial physical separation, largely along the 1967 Green Line, but dipping into the West Bank in places to include major settlement blocks. Israel argued it was purely for security, to stop bombers. Palestinians saw it as a land grab, further fragmenting their territory and prejudging future borders. It physically solidified the division and the deep, deep mistrust between the two communities.
Okay, so amidst all this conflict, being constantly surrounded by hostility, operating with very limited natural resources, a situation echoing maybe 3,000 years of struggle, how did Israel manage to transform itself into this economic and technological powerhouse, the startup nation?
It's truly an astonishing story, and really seems rooted in that same old theme, sheer necessity breeding ingenuity. Survival, in the modern context, demanded not just military strength, but also economic self-reliance and technological innovation.
Were there key figures driving this?
One figure often credited is Shimon Peres, who we mentioned shared the Nobel Prize for Oslo. Throughout his long career, Peres was not just a politician, but a key architect of Israel's defense industry, including its reported nuclear program. Critically, he understood and fostered the essential link between government investment, military R&D, and the private technology sector, creating that ecosystem.
And this focus led directly to world-leading defense tech, born out of that constant need for security.
The Iron Dome missile defense system is the perfect, most famous example. A technological marvel developed almost entirely out of the specific urgent need to protect Israeli civilian centers from constant short-range rocket attacks fired from Gaza and Lebanon. Necessity was the mother of that invention.
But the innovation went way beyond just defense, into the commercial sphere.
Absolutely. And the sources highlight figures like Yossi Vardi, often called the godfather of Israeli high-tech. He was an early entrepreneur and investor.
He co-founded ICQ.
Yes. Back in the mid-1990s, Vardi was an early investor in Mirabilis, the Israeli company that created ICQ, arguably the world's first widely adopted instant messaging platform. Its huge success, being acquired by AOL, really helped spark the startup nation phenomenon. It showed Israeli tech could compete globally.
And that inspired a whole ecosystem.
Completely. Today, Israel has one of the highest concentrations of startups and tech engineers per capita in the world. Major global giants like Intel, Microsoft, Google, Apple all have massive R&D centers there. And homegrown Israeli innovations like Waze, navigation, Mobileye, autonomous driving tech, checkpoint software, cybersecurity are world leaders.
But it's telling, isn't it, that even many of the commercial successes, like cybersecurity, are still closely linked to that security focus.
It's definitely symptomatic of the geopolitical reality. Decades of needing cutting-edge signals, intelligence, encryption, and defense systems created a deep pool of talent and expertise in areas that are now highly valuable commercially, especially in cybersecurity.
Okay, so bringing us right up to the present day, what's the current geopolitical landscape? There have been some surprising diplomatic shifts recently.
Yes, the Abraham Accords, brokered primarily by the U.S. Trump administration starting in 2020, have been a significant development. These agreements normalize relations between Israel and several Arab nations, the UAE, Bahrain, later Sudan, and Morocco.
Bypassing the Palestinian issue.
Essentially, yes. These deals were driven more by shared concerns about Iran, economic interests, and a changing regional dynamic. They offered new paths for trade, tourism, and diplomatic engagement that weren't tied to resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict first. A major shift in Arab world priorities for some states.
But the number one existential threat in Israel's view remains
the Islamic Republic of Iran. Iran's nuclear program, its development of ballistic missiles, its hostile anti-Israel ideology, and its funding and arming of proxy forces across the region. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza, militias in Syria and Iraq all combine to make Iran the primary strategic threat from Israel's perspective.
And this leads to a kind of shadow war.
A constant, undeclared shadow war. Cyber attacks, assassinations of nuclear scientists, which Iran blames on Israel, sabotage. The source material specifically notes that dramatic Mossad operation a few years back, where they supposedly extracted Iran's entire secret nuclear archive from a warehouse in Tehran. It highlights Israel's proactive, aggressive stance aimed at preventing Iran from ever obtaining nuclear weapons capability. It's a high-stakes, ongoing confrontation.
And meanwhile, the core conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian issue, it remains stuck, centered on the same old unresolved points.
Tragically, yes. Despite decades of efforts, the fundamental issues remain the major flashpoints. The final status of Jerusalem, claimed by both sides. The continued expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank, which most of the world considers illegal and an obstacle to a two-state solution. And the dire humanitarian situation and ongoing blockade of the Gaza Strip, which has been under the control of the Islamist group Hamas since 2007 after they violently ousted the Palestinian Authority.
And the deep mistrust, symbolized by that barrier wall.
It continues to fuel the cycle of violence, political stalemate, and prevents any real progress towards a lasting political resolution that could satisfy the national aspirations and security needs of both Israelis and Palestinians. It remains an open wound.
Wow, okay. After this incredibly intense deep dive, covering 3,000 years, from that first mention on the Merneptah Stele, its seed is no more, all the way to the Iron Dome and the Abraham Accords. What is the ultimate synthesis? What's the core takeaway from this unbelievable survival story?
I think the central theme has to be that uncompromising resilience, but resilience achieved primarily through a constant process of intellectual and spiritual transformation. Think about it. They lost their sacred homeland and central temple not just once, but twice. Each time, it should logically have extinguished their distinct identity and faith, like so many other ancient peoples.
But it didn't.
It didn't. Instead, they survived by radically adapting, by codifying their identity not in stone and territory alone, but in portable sacred texts, the Torah, the Talmud, later the Kabbalah, and in portable institutions like the synagogue, guided by the rabbis who became the new leaders after the priests lost their temple.
So that spiritual and intellectual foundation forged during those 2 millennia without a state, that's what allowed them to endure and then transition.
No, I think that's the argument the sources make. That foundation is what allowed them to survive dispersion, persecution, and ultimately to transition almost seamlessly into the modern era, eventually building a democratic, technologically advanced state, even while still grappling with those ancient existential threats.
It's just an extraordinary history. From grappling with the idea of a localized, maybe even tribal warrior god, to facing the absolute worst industrial-scale annihilation in human history. And now dealing with cutting-edge cyber warfare, artificial intelligence, and even those esoteric cosmic interpretations we touched on.
It really is a continuous narrative of profound transformation. A nomadic tribe becoming a global, incredibly diverse culture, and then partly reforming as a nation-state.
So maybe the final provocative thought for our listeners to consider after this whole journey.
I think is this. Does the geopolitical reality today, the existence of the physical, powerful, technological state of Israel, represent the final culmination of that 3,000-year struggle for security in a dangerous world? Is the state the ultimate guarantor of survival? Or does the key to this nation's unique, almost unbelievable long-term survival remain primarily where it was forged during those 2 millennia of statelessness? In the spiritual and intellectual identity carried not by armies or defense systems, but by ideas, by texts, by debate, and by that ancient, demanding, but ultimately unbreakable covenant.
State versus spirit, or maybe both are needed now.
Which element is truly the bedrock of their endurance? That's the profound, maybe unanswerable question this incredible history leaves for all of us, and especially for you listening, to ponder.